Hey everybody, let's talk about leadership. In particular, how to be a good leader. Well, the first thing we got to do is define what the hell leadership is so we can understand what we're talking about. And I'm glad you're joining me today to do this. I'm going to use my good friend ChatGPT, and we're going to explore this. And I'm going to critique what it says to see if it's talking sense. So here we go. Okay, so let's talk leadership. Now, the problem with discussing this that I have is that everybody seems to be using a different definition of the word leadership. And as far as I can tell, there's basically 4 definitions of this that someone could be referring to when they say how to be a good leader. The first definition is leadership as defined by management science, like in business. What is a good leader? And the concept of leadership. The second could be, when people talk about leadership, they talk about, it's like a synonym for confidence, ambition, initiative, basically the traits that would make them management material, which is something totally different from what business teaches is leadership. The third definition, I think people use that term when they mean that they want to be in the driving seat of their life. They don't want to be a passenger in their own life. They want to be a leader. They want to take charge. They want to have a goal and they want to work towards that goal with specific actions. So in that sense, they want to be a leader. And then finally, the most slippery of the bunch is a modern definition of leadership that equates it with kindness, altruism, and empathy, which is not supported by management science. It's not the definition of leadership in business. It's some new definition that people have made up and just accept as true, when I contend that it really isn't, but that's how people are using the term. Is this accurate? Is this an accurate appraisal of what leadership means? How's that for a prompt? Yeah, I'd say there's 4 definitions. Maybe there's more than I even know about. Okay, let's see here. So you're not wrong that the word leadership gets used in multiple overlapping ways, but your framing is a bit too clean. Yep, I got to be corrected. That's modern ChatGPT. Has to correct everybody. In reality, these meanings bleed into each other more than your 4 buckets suggest. Okay, I don't know about that. Let's see. A more grounded way to look at it. So leadership in management science. Management science is the closest thing to a formal definition. Well, it is a formal definition. In this context, leadership is about setting direction, aligning people, and getting results through others. Absolutely. In the sense that you have to have followers. In order to be a leader, you got to have followers. You don't just declare yourself a good leader. Being a good leader is directly observed in that you can produce followers that are influenced by you, and you can measure how they're influenced by you, right? It's not just a matter of how you see yourself. It's, a bit more scientific than that. It's tied to outcomes. If no one follows or nothing gets achieved, it's not leadership. Exactly. So basically, it's another word for influencing. But even here, there's no single definition. Academic literature ranges from trait theory. Well, no, this is wrong. These were previous theories. Behavioral theory, leaders act in certain ways, and situational leadership. No, these aren't different definitions. These are all part of what it is. I disagree with that. And we can get into it. Leadership as management potential traits. What you described here is very real. People use leadership, quote unquote, as shorthand for confidence, initiative, assertiveness, ambition. I would love to do a video on how to develop these traits. So confidence, ambition, initiative, certainly you can definitely talk about those and things like decisiveness, what people associate with, quote unquote, leadership qualities. And I will do that video, maybe in a part 2 to this. That would be really cool. At least I think so. Let me know in the comments if you agree. Okay, what they often mean is we want someone who looks promotable. Yeah, Yeah, so like the traits that make you look like management material. This is less about leading others and more about signaling upward mobility. Yeah, see, that's why it's not leadership. These are good things, and these are definitely traits that some effective leaders have, but in themselves, that's not leadership. It's not wrong, but it's definitely a different concept from actually leading a team. Well, it is wrong, but it's how people use the word, so we just have to deal with it. Okay, number 3, leadership is personal agency. This is the self-help version. Be a leader in your own life really means take responsibility, make decisions, act intentionally. Okay, this has almost nothing to do with other people. It's closer to discipline, ownership, and goal-oriented behavior. Calling it leadership is more metaphor than definition, but it resonates, which is why it sticks. Okay, I would agree with that. This is another way of looking at it, but like you're a leader of yourself in a weird way. You're leading yourself, as opposed to, what was it? Be a lotus and float on the river of life? Like being in the passenger seat of your own life and just seeing what happens and just going with the flow, Now, this is the one I was asking about. Leadership is empathy/kindness. This is where your take needs refinement. Oh boy, here we go. You're right that this framing is newer in popularity and often overstated, but it is not made up or unsupported. Okay, well, let's see. Modern leadership research, especially post-1990s, introduces ideas like emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. These explicitly include empathy, inspiration, and relationship building. The key distinction is this: empathy is not leadership by itself, but effective leadership often requires it. Yeah, exactly. Like these are, like, look, let me just say something about this definition, okay? I've seen the term leadership associated with ideas like humanism and altruism, empathy, kindness, listening to people, supporting people, being kind to people. Now, I'm not saying that these are bad traits. Far from it. These are very, very good virtues, and I'm not putting them down in any way. What I am saying is that, if you're someone who is exhibiting these traits, you're kind to others, you're listening, you're supporting them, you're empathetic, etc., I just wouldn't define you as a leader. You could be many things. You could be a supporter, you could be a friend, you could be even a therapist, but I would not describe it as a leader, someone who's assuming these traits. Yes, leaders can exhibit these traits along with many others, but these traits are not leadership. That's what I'm contending. Okay, so ChatGPT may give me an argument on this, but I don't think so. I have no doubt that people have introduced these ideas, transformational leader. Yes, I've heard of these. I understand what they are, but that doesn't necessarily mean that now becomes what leadership is. It's a possibility, and it's not universally accepted. Okay, so the modern mistake isn't including empathy. I'm not saying it was. It's treating empathy as sufficient. Exactly. And that is what I was saying. So you're agreeing with me while telling me I got it wrong, but then you agree with me. Okay, so let's get into this here. Let's talk about the first trait. So here's the deal. Up until about approximately 1950 or so, in the 1950s, what they taught in business school about leadership was that leaders were born. You had a certain collection of traits, and all leaders had those traits, right? Things like being aggressive, things like being charismatic, or being highly intelligent, or even things like being tall, right? These were what they taught. You had like a list of traits, and that defined a great person, and you could be a leader. Now, the problem started arising when they tried to get scientific proof of this. And they found that, just when you think like a certain trait is universal of leaders, all leaders should have this, you always find an exception. you find a person who's unquestionably a great leader, but they didn't have that trait. So, for example, you have to be very good looking to be a leader. Well, people like Winston Churchill break that mold. Or, you have to be very aggressive or assertive or extrovert to be a leader. And then you see someone like Gandhi, that completely breaks that mold. So you have to be really cool, really, fashionable. And, you see someone like Bill Gates and that he completely breaks that mold, So every single trait that they could think of, they found some pretty glaring exceptions where it seemed to suggest that that trait was not, in fact, universal. And they found that every single trait was questionable. So there is no list of traits that every leader must have. So therefore, after the 1950s, the consensus was that leaders are not born, leaders are made, which means that in theory, anybody could be a leader. And this is using the first definition of leadership, the actual academic definition, which is a leader who influences followers, someone who leads followers, right? The followers do what the leader wants them to do, right? That's what leadership is leading people. So that was the modern thinking on leadership, and that's what is founded leadership in a business sense today. Now, leadership has existed in the military and it's existed in the political arena and in other areas. I'm a business guy, so I'm confining my discussion here to business sense of leadership. And that's what's taught in business school, that definition. And this idea that anybody can be a leader. There are no universal traits of it. Leadership is essentially influencing. So if you can influence people, then you are a leader. Now, there's more to it too, and ChatGPT mentioned some of it, some of these other things, like saying that it is conditional on the situation. Where was that? I think it broke this out somewhere. I can't remember precisely where. Yeah, here, situational leadership. So what they found was that like some leaders are great in some situations, but you put them in a different situation, they're terrible, So it is dependent on the context, right? There's no such thing as a universal good leader that will be a good leader in any situation under any conditions to any group of followers. That isn't a thing. Okay, so, and then trait theory, that was like pre-1950. Behavioral theory, that's more after 1950. But the other thing was that the people that noticed common traits weren't completely crazy either for noticing these common traits. There are a lot of traits that, while not absolutely essential, they do correlate with being a leader. If you have these traits, there's a higher likelihood that you would be a good leader, right? So they weren't totally crazy in noticing those traits come up again and again and again. It's just false to say that you must have those traits to be a leader. That's the idea. Okay. Now let's get into some of the things here. When we talk about the second definition, leadership is management potential. As I said, I'm going to do a video where we're going to get into like how to develop your confidence, how to develop a sense of initiative, meaning that you're proactive and you make things happen as opposed to just waiting for things to happen to you. Assertiveness, I don't think that's as much of a trait in this case, at least in my opinion. I don't think it's as important. Certainly in some contexts, people that are very aggressive, very assertive, yes, that can serve you well, but in other contexts, you really don't need it that much, as I've observed. Ambition, yes, that really helps. We can talk about that. There was one other that was really a part of that. I think what was it here? We have ambition, confidence, initiative. Yeah, there's more here, and I'll talk about those in a separate video. But if you're doing it from the perspective of like your goal is to get promoted, then that's one thing. But you could have other goals in life other than being promoted. Maybe you want to be an entrepreneur. Maybe you want to be an investor. Maybe you want to do something else. It's not all about the context of being promotable in a business. So it really depends on what your goals are, why you would cultivate some of these traits. Okay, now leadership is personal agency. This is where I think when I get questions on my main YouTube channel, people say, how do I become a better leader? I suspect this is maybe what they're referring to. How can I be more decisive? Yeah, that was the one I want to talk about, decisiveness. Some people, they kind of, they don't want to make a decision. It's just, kind of intimidating. So here, if you're wanting to be a leader to yourself and take charge of your life, or feel like you're taking charge of your life more and making things happen, okay? So you would develop some of these things. Making decisions, acting intentionally. That also really depends on knowing what to do, right? That's the big hurdle there. It's less about just the inability to act and more about not knowing what to do, Discipline, ownership, goal-directed behavior. Yeah. The problem is that people that want to make things happen, my personal opinion is that, you have all this intentionality and drive and focus, but you often spend it on the wrong things. You think you need to go in a direction, but it turns out you don't. So it would be interesting to get into this one. I think the biggest single biggest thing you can do here is learn what to do. And the best way to learn what to do is look up examples, look at what other people have done. So if you want to be in a certain role, the thing to do would be to find out who are the people that managed to get into that role and how did they do it? So I would recommend, the approach there would be to seek these people out, which in terms of careers, you certainly can do on websites like LinkedIn. You can do searches for people that are in a certain role, and then you can see what's on their profile, like, how they got there. Here's their career progression. And then you can reach out to them and, have informational interviews and stuff with them and say, like, so tell me, how did you go from here to here? What was the thing that allowed that to be possible, and how did you know to do that? Or, and then you get even more insight into that kind of stuff. So once you know what to do or the types of things you can do, then it becomes more clear of what, how to get there. So a lot of this stuff, goal directed, it gets much more efficient because you're doing the right things, not what seems like the right thing, but what actually is the right thing to achieve the result. Okay, now leadership is empathy. We've already talked about how basically, I'm not knocking altruism and a lot of these traits. I think it's good. It's just that I disagree that, defining those as leadership is the big problem here. That is pseudoscientific. That's not something that's has been demonstrated. It even says here, empathy is not leadership by itself, but effective leadership often requires it. It often requires it, but not universally requires it. There are situations where, like, for example, think of a catastrophe, think of an emergency, is empathy and listening, or at least empathy, is that really like the number one thing you need to be a good leader in a crisis, like in a catastrophe? Maybe there's a medical emergency and someone needs quick, decisive action of a very specific kind, to live or something. I don't think servant leadership is really the best approach, or empathy or kindness. Yes, those are definitely good traits, but, in this case, you need direction, you need a clear vision of what needs to happen. And it's not about asking everybody for their opinions and getting consensus. It's about taking charge, making decisions, knowing what to do, and, being able to carry that out as quickly as possible, regardless of people's feelings in the moment. You know what I mean? So listen, it's a matter of debate. I would argue that, in certain situations, these traits are actively the opposite of what you would need. If you're trying to whip something into shape, or people have been sabotaging some kind of operation, you have to resolve it. I would argue that, maybe some of this is not the best approach. So, yeah, it also suggests that it's confusing the result from the method, right? Some of these traits are very effective methods of achieving a good result, but they are not the method in itself. And there's a danger in thinking that this is the method, because it implies that all you have to do in any situation to effectively lead is to show empathy and, all these traits, when that may not be the way to get out of it and to lead people to success. Yeah, and there are a lot of examples. I want to do a video where we talk about the leadership style of Ernest Shackleton, who was a polar explorer who made a name for himself and had some very interesting stories there in some leadership type situations he had to deal with. So we'll get into that on a future video too. That would be really good to explore. But this ties in this whole empathy, the fourth definition, that really ties in with the Ernst Shackleton thing, because he showed great empathy to his followers in life and death situations and saved everybody's life. But what he did was very much situational. His approach completely changed depending on what situation they found themselves in, and to great effect. So there is definitely a flip side to this. I just want to read the conclusion here. Bottom line, your four categories are directionally accurate, but they're not fully separate. No, I didn't say they were. The empathy definition isn't baseless, just overextended. Well, no, it wasn't. And the real issue is that people use the same word for different incentives. Well, they use the same word for different concepts. That's the problem when talking about leadership with people. If you treat leadership as context dependent rather than a single definition, the confusion disappears. Yeah, the problem is that you end up talking cross purposes. I talk about leadership from a business school perspective. The scientific study of business and how you influence people in a business. That's kind of where I'm coming from. That's maybe a little bit different when you're talking about empathy as a definition of leadership, and some of the concepts within this. Here, I'll run one more thing by this at the risk of lengthening this. Okay, so within the concept of that fourth definition, I know that there's concepts like servant leadership and transformational leadership that have come up in relatively modern management studies. But I wouldn't use that as a backing to show that this fourth definition of leadership is technically correct. I don't think that leadership is empathy or kindness, any more than it's punishment, but leaders can exhibit both. They can be very empathetic and they can be very kind. They can also dole out punishments as a tactic for influencing. But I wouldn't define leadership as the ability to give punishment any more than I would define leadership as the trait of having empathy or exhibiting kindness. Don't worry, I'm sure I'm going to be wrong, because everything I say to ChatGPT, it turns out I'm wrong, even when it then agrees with me. Wow, look at that. I never thought I'd hear these words. You're drawing an important distinction, and on this point, you're basically right. Okay. Wow, I wasn't expecting you to agree with that. Where I'd push back slightly, here we go, is not your conclusion about how cleanly you're separating things. Well, I'm talking off the top of my head, so it's not going to be extremely clean like a peer-reviewed academic paper. Your core issue, definition versus tools. What you're really saying is don't confuse what leadership is with what leaders sometimes use. That's solid, yes. Empathy, kindness, punishment, incentives, authority, these are all tools or behaviors, not the definition. And you're right. Defining leadership as empathy is just as flawed as defining it as punishment. Both tactics, may or may not be true. So you're agreeing with me. Where modern frameworks complicate it, concepts like servant leadership and transformational leadership don't actually say leadership is kindness. Exactly. But I've heard these two things back up this idea that leadership is empathy. It doesn't. What they try to argue is these behaviors tend to produce better outcomes when leading humans. I agree. I definitely agree with that. But that's not what the definition of leadership is. For example, transformational leadership emphasizes inspiration, trust, and emotional connection. Yes. Servant leadership emphasizes prioritizing the team's needs. Yes. And those can be very, very effective. But even in those frameworks, the underlying assumption is still there is a goal, there is a group, and there is influence towards that goal. They're prescribing how to lead effectively, not redefining leadership itself. Exactly. I'm surprised. This thing hit the nail on the head. The mistake people make, and that you're reacting to, the confusion happens when people collapse this. Empathy is often effective in leadership. Into this, empathy is leadership. That leap is intellectually sloppy, but extremely common. Yes. It's appealing because it moralizes the concept. A good person means a good leader. And no, but reality doesn't cooperate with that. Sorry. Reality doesn't cooperate with that. There we go. Let's put the accents on the right syllables. You can have highly empathetic people who cannot lead, and you can have highly effective leaders who are not especially kind. Absolutely. History is full of both. The sharper framing, and this is the useful gem, a cleaner way of saying what you're getting at is leadership is neutral, methods of leadership are not, or even tighter. Leadership is about influence. Empathy, punishment, incentives, these are all levers of influence, or levers, depending on your point of view. That framing avoids all the confusion. It doesn't moralize leadership. It doesn't reduce it to personality traits. It keeps the definition stable across contexts. Where your view is strongest. Okay, I'm still wrong, right? Your argument is especially strong in business contexts. Yeah, okay, bottom line. Where was I wrong? Okay, I was strong there. Bottom line, you're right to reject leadership. Okay, we're just going over the same thing. The more precise version is leadership is influencing towards a goal, and empathy and kindness are tools that can improve that influence in certain contexts. Absolutely. Once you separate the definition from the methods, the whole debate becomes much clearer. Yes. Okay, I think we've put this problem in perspective. I think we know what leadership is, because there's a lot of weird concepts that people are throwing around. And most discussions about leadership involve people talking past each other because they've each defined it as something different and they're trying to debate it. I find that that's why a lot of conversations of this nature don't really go anywhere, especially on the internet. So now we're clear about what we're talking about. So I would like to do a video on definition number 2, how you can cultivate some of those traits that will, make you more promotable, right? That was the second definition, make you management material, those kinds of traits. I'll do a video on that. And I'd like to do another video, a third video on Ernst Shackleton, because that's something I wanted to talk about, which was he was years ahead of his time in terms of his leadership skills. And he saved every single member of a doomed Antarctic expedition where they were about to die in the ice of Antarctica. And he not only kept them together, he led them to safety. And it was not easy, but exhibiting a very interesting and contrasting combination of tactics. So that's why this individual, this guy, is studied in business school or in some business school context. Anyway, hopefully you found that interesting. There'll be more videos talking about this in the future. Thanks for watching. You're awesome. Have yourself a great day, and I'll see you next time.